Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and very, very happy to welcome you to what I think you're going to find to be an exceptionally interesting and well-informed panel. We've had the pleasure earlier today to listen to. My wife is telling me to speak into the microphone. Okay. Usually she's telling me to be quiet, so actually this is a pleasure for once. She's telling me to speak up. But anyway, as I said, you're really in for a wonderful, wonderful experience today. The panel is the subject of today's panel, of course, is the 50th anniversary, the Cuban Revolution at 50. And I would simply mention that this is a time for a number of very important anniversaries. It's also the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And for those of us, who, Denny Goodman is sitting over here, who spent our lives, in the State Department hoping to break that doggone thing down and to end, the Soviet Union as it was, that's also a very significant anniversary for us. And indeed, I think that there is a strong relationship because, as you know, when the Berlin Wall fell within 2 years, the communist regimes in Eastern Europe and, of course, all across and into the Soviet Union had all fallen away. And it's really one of the intriguing questions, puzzles, if you will, as to why, the Cuban Revolution survived the collapse of the Soviet Union and communism in Eastern Europe. And it's a subject I think that we will touch on today. Before introducing the panel members, I just want to thank another person who's in the audience, and that's Miguel Valladares, who's sitting in the back. There is a beautiful, beautiful exhibition at Baker Library in the main hall that you all should go to see, that Miguel is primarily responsible for. But it's on the Cuban Revolution, on Cuba, and it's really a very, very wonderful piece. And Miguel, thank you very much for that wonderful work. We have 4 panelists with us today, and what I'm going to do is briefly tell you about each of them. I'm not going to talk very long because you came to hear them, not me. But I'm also going to, as I introduce each one, just going to suggest perhaps a question that they may want to address in the course of their remarks. And the way we'll organize the panel today is I'll ask each of the 4, to speak, and probably, I'll see how the order that I have here. And then I'd like to give the panelists an opportunity, after all 4 have spoken, to respond to each other if they wish. Then we will open it up to questions, and as usual, at Dickey Center events, we always give students priority in asking questions. But our panelists are as follows. Professor Lars Schoultz, and Lars is at my far left there, even though I'm not talking political spectrum here, I'm just placing people. But Lars is a professor of political science at the University of North Carolina, the William Rand Keenan Jr. Professor of Political Science. And his area of special interest is inter-American relations. And he spoke to us earlier today on U.S. policy with regard to Cuba, and it was absolutely fascinating. He's had so many honors, it's almost impossible to go through them, but he's written several books, many articles, and his area, as I said, of special interest is inter-American relations. He's been a Fulbright Hayes doctoral dissertation fellowship in Buenos Aires. He's received, he's at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington, and many other awards. So a very distinguished scholar and analyst of U.S. policy toward Latin America, and has written a book on that subject, books I should say. Next to him is Anita Snow, who spent 10 years in Havana as the bureau chief of the Associated Press and has just had incredible experiences there. She is now a Nieman Fellow in journalism at that little university in Boston. I forget, begins with an H, Harvard or something like that. But anyway, Anita, we're delighted to have you as well. And then sitting to her right is Professor Luis Perez, who's the J. Carlisle Citizen Professor of History at the University of North Carolina. And his principal teaching fields include 20th century Latin America, the Caribbean, and Cuba. He's edited and written 15 books, and his articles have appeared in the principal journals of the profession. And he gave us a wonderful presentation earlier today on nationalism and the drive for Cuban nationalism, national identity, and self-determination in the 19th century as being so critical in terms of understanding Cuba today. And then finally, to my immediate left is Dan Erikson, as a Senior Associate for U.S. Policy and Director of Caribbean Programs at the Inter-American Dialogue. He's published more than 60 articles in a variety of noteworthy publications, the LA Times, Miami Herald, Washington Post. He wrote a book which was recently published and very highly acclaimed, entitled The Cuba Wars, Fidel Castro, the United States, and the Next Revolution. And he was cast today into the position basically of prophet, of trying to anticipate what's going to happen with U.S. policy towards Cuba and the time frame. Now, the questions, as I mentioned, that I just asking, I'm not going to hold our panelists to them, but I just wanted to pose to them as we go through. First, actually, it might be better for Luis Perez to start off as the historian. It might be good, if you don't mind, Luis. What can a longer historical perspective help us to understand about Cuba's future and U.S.-Cuba relations that we might otherwise miss? And of course, Luis is the historian. Anita, do Cubans want fundamental changes to their political system? How is it possible to know? And also, given your particular area of expertise, I'd like you to say something about press freedoms in Cuba. I think that would be a very interesting subject. Lars, the relationship between the U.S. and Cuban governments has been marked much more by tension and distrust than by cooperation and goodwill for well over a century. Is this because the two countries' national interests are inherently at odds, or are there other factors such as ideological elements? And finally, Dan, our prophet, when and how will the embargo end? And also, if you might say a word about support for the embargo in the United States, sort of what's going on with the Cuban American community in terms of your assessment on that. So I would love then to turn it over to Luis Perez to begin the discussions. Luis.
Thank you. I apologize because the questions I was asked to address tonight, I addressed them at 1 o'clock. So I'm trying to think of what am I going to be doing here for the next 10, 15 minutes. And so I've got it. A quick history lesson. We who study Latin America have arrived at a kind of conventional wisdom that Americans will do anything for Latin America except read about it. And so what I'm going to do for the next 10 minutes is provide a kind of real thumbnail sketch of the history of Cuba as a way to understanding the Cuban Revolution and peek into the future. With all due apologies in advance to Puerto Rican and Dominican colleagues in the room, we who study the Spanish Caribbean and we talk about the phenomenon of sovereignty, say that Puerto Ricans surrender. Dominicans negotiate. And Cubans are kamikaze. In 1991, when in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet collapse and the bottom opened up in Cuba, Fidel Castro took to the airwaves and a long and passionate speech indicated what Cuba's future might look like under the circumstances. And one of the things that he said was that if it was necessary, if it became necessary for Cubans to return to the caves, and live the way they lived before the Europeans arrived, that's what they would do before they would ever surrender. Now, people heard that, and people read that, and they, of course, immediately assumed this is absolutely a madman. How can anyone plausibly propose that people in Cuba are going back to the caves and not surrender? I would submit that those who said that Fidel Castro was a madman have no knowledge of Cuban history. For if you were to read, for example, the writings and the letters and the diaries of, I'll just pull out a couple of names, José Martí. José Martí was the great prophet of death before dishonor, death before surrender, death before relinquishing the dream of Cuban sovereignty. Cubans burned their cities between 1868 and 1898. They would burn their cities before they would relinquish their cities to the Spanish. Cubans would commit suicide before they would surrender to the Spanish. City after city that the Cubans took between 1868 and 1898, which they knew they could only hold for a very short period of time, upon which the Spanish would regroup and then mount their offensive, they would burn. In the city of Bayamo, the residents, I'm not talking about outsiders, the residents of the city of Bayamo, when they understood that the Spanish were about to mount a siege and recapture the city, burned their own homes down, burned their own shops down before relinquishing control of the city to the enemy. In other words, this idea, this kamikaze, runs deep, deep in what we can call the Cuban psyche. I'm fascinated with the phenomenon of national character. Is there such a thing as national character, and how do we look at this in Cuba? In 1898, August 1898, August 12th to be exact, the Spanish surrendered to General William Shafter, the chief of the American Expeditionary Force in the war with Spain. And Shafter, as he prepared to take control of the city of Santiago de Cuba, began to make arrangements to accept the surrender of the Spanish and turn to the Cuban commander, his erstwhile ally, and said to General Calixto Garcia, "You cannot enter the city of Santiago. Not you, not your officers, not your soldiers." Notwithstanding the fact that Calixto Garcia was from the city of Holguin, which is the neighboring city of Santiago, notwithstanding the fact that many of Garcia's officers and enlisted men were from the city of Santiago, they were told that they could not enter the city of Santiago. Why? Because General Shafter, the North American commander, said that they would plunder, they would pillage, they would loot, they would be an irresponsible element, and hence could not enter the city of Santiago. That is to say, Cubans couldn't enter their own cities. Calixto Garcia denounced the American leader, broke relations with the American Expeditionary Force, resigned his commission, and told the commander-in-chief, General Máximo Gómez, that he could no longer continue to cooperate with the American Army. August 1898. I mention this because on January 1st, 1959, Batista had fled. And Fidel Castro takes to the airwaves to announce to the people of Santiago de Cuba that the dictator had fled. And that the rebel army was planning to come from the Sierra Maestra Mountains into the city of Santiago. And Fidel Castro, in January 1959, begins to give a little history lesson. And he says, and I'll just give you this one passage. He says, people of Santiago de Cuba, the dictator has fled, the revolution has triumphed. The rebel army tomorrow will descend in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra Mountains. And then he says, and this time, the victorious army of liberation will not be kept out of Santiago de Cuba. Wow. 50 years later. Now, if there was anybody in the American embassy who knew that much Cuban history, the first thing that they would have to have asked is a very simple question. Why the hell is he bringing that up? Why? That's history. For 50 years, Cubans carried that moment in their psyche. The humiliation of being told by an occupation army that they could not enter their own cities. For 50 years, this was transmitted from 1, 2, 3 generations. And when Fidel Castro takes to the airwaves and says that this time the rebel army will not be kept out of Santiago de Cuba, he is sending a coded message, a very, very profound coded message. And he's saying, this time it's different. This time we are now going to resume where we were on August 11th, 1898. We are now picking up our history. Now, I mention this because, for me, as a historian, it becomes impossible to understand the endurance of the Cuban leadership, of the Cuban Revolution, without an appreciation for that historical context that so has powerfully informed Cuban sensibilities. Admittedly, not all Cubans fall in the thrall of the Cuban psyche. We've already talked about 1 million people have left Cuba, of course. But for those who remain, for those who cherish the proposition of sovereignty, for those who cherish the idea of self-determination, it is a proposition that Cubans have already indicated in rather forceful terms that they will indeed pay the price, whatever the price, however long the price, to maintain sovereignty. That issue of sovereignty is the single driving element, of the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro has just informed a whole generation of Cubans that sovereignty and self-determination is indeed worth the price that Cubans have been paying since 1868. Thank you.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I guess I didn't know the... Good evening. So when I was thinking about the evening session of this seminar, I was thinking about freedom of expression in Cuba. What do Cubans think? Do we know what they think? Will they tell us what they think? And I remember this joke people used to tell a lot when I was living in Havana, and it talks about an American who comes to Cuba and he's there for a few days and he's looking around and he's like, there's no freedom of expression here. People won't tell me anything. So he goes to his friend Raphael, this fellow he met on the street who wanted to be his guide, and he says, Raphael, I don't get it. He said, in my country, I could go stand in front of the White House. I can scream out, Bajo Bush, down with Bush, and nobody will pay me any attention. Nothing will happen to me. So Raphael said, Chico, it's the same here. I can go to the Plaza of the Revolution, stand out front of the Council of State building and yell, Bajo Bush, and nothing will happen to me either. Freedom of expression, as Americans know, it really doesn't exist in Cuba. People will tell you, quietly what they think, but no one's going to stand out in front of the Council of State and yell, Bajo Fidel, Bajo Raul. They just won't do it. They know that the minute they do that, they'll get picked up and they'll be taken away. People do talk about their circumstances. They'll complain about their food ration. They'll complain about the bus doesn't come on time. They'll complain that they can't get a permit to fix their house, that they don't have enough food to last a month. But they won't speak out that loudly and that directly. Being a journalist working in Cuba, we had a lot of problems with access to officials. We'd write a letter asking to talk to, somebody in the foreign ministry, and they just wouldn't answer us. So you'd just be waiting, nobody will talk to us. So a lot of times we'd have to talk to dissidents. You talk to people on the streets, they don't want to give you their name because they're afraid. It's just a really difficult proposition. And now in Cuba, the press is all official. There's Grandma, which is the voice of the Communist Party, is the main newspaper. And Juventud Rebelde is another main daily, which is also operated by the party/government. And all the people who work there are paid by the government. There's no independent newspapers, there's no independent radio, television, etc. There have been some moves in recent years, particularly under the rule of Raul Castro, since Fidel Castro got sick. There have been some sort of attempts inside Juventud Rebelde to start being a little bit more open, a little more critical of the government. And there have been some articles that have been quite interesting, complaining about life on the island, complaining about corruption for instance, in stores, theft in stores, that sort of thing. But there's just limits still. There was, I was reading this morning, I have the article here. There was, over the weekend, a gentleman who works for Juventud Rebelde published an article online on Juventud Rebelde website over the weekend, and it disappeared mysteriously within about an hour. And it was called Contra los demonios de la información secuestrado, against the demons of the kidnapped information. It was a critique of how the official press informs the public, and it disappeared. There's a guy who works in Havana for BBC in Spanish named Fernando Ravsberg, who I know, and who's a real tiger. Went and interviewed this guy, and the guy told him, please, he wrote a whole article about this, and he's talking about how he tried to talk to this guy, Jose Alejandro Rodriguez, and he said Rodriguez declined the invitation to converse with BBC Mundo, and basically quoted the guy saying, don't quote me, I'm going to get in trouble and there might be a big, backlash. So I don't know what's going to happen to this guy after this article, quite frankly. I kind of feel bad for him. But the point being is there have been some attempts inside the official media to sort of open it up, but they're pushed back, every time. So it's pretty difficult there. The other thing that's been in the news lately, which has been kind of interesting in the same area, is there's a blogger named Ioanni Sanchez. I don't know if you guys have heard about her. But a couple of years ago, she started her own blog. It's called Generation Y. Generation Y for names that begin with Y. Her name begins with Y. There's a whole generation of young Cubans with these names their parents made up that begin with Y. Ioanni, use Lexis, use ladies. So she kind of dedicated to the people of her generation and encouraging them to read it, although they don't really have access to it. But she's been getting her word out on this blog. She started going to some of the hotels that have internet access and sort of posing as a tourist, and went in there and paid. You have to pay to get internet access, and started doing this blog. So she's become quite an international an international celebrity practically. She's on Huffington Post. And she just writes about life, and she complains about, a lot of the struggles of daily life on the island, which are multitude. Last week she was honored with a very important journalism award at Columbia University, but was unable to go. The Cuban government would not give her an exit visa, so she wasn't able to do that. But I guess what's interesting is she's found a way to do this. She's using the new technology to do this. So I went back and I started looking at her blog, because I've been out of Cuba for about 3 months now. And it's really interesting. I mean, she's blogs about 2 or 3 times a week. And she just discovered Twitter. So she's Twittering, which I thought was fascinating, because this is anybody who's been reading about the Iranian elections and seeing how the Iranians were getting word out through Twitter. If the people on the island discover Twitter, that's going to be interesting, because a lot of people have cell phones now. They have and Cubans are just ingenious people. They figure out how to do this stuff once they get their hands on these gadgets. So if they learn how to Twitter, using their cell phones, it's going to be quite interesting. And she's learned how to do video. She's got a little video cam, and she has her husband videotape her, like they're out in front of the immigration office. She's why they wouldn't give her an exit visa, and she posts that. And a lot of Cubans have these little video cams now too. These new sort of tools to tell their stories. And it's interesting, in my program at Harvard, the Nieman Foundation, there's a whole class every Friday in multimedia. I mean, we have to learn how to do these things Ioanni is using. We're learning how to do Twitter. I mean, I've never used Twitter before, but this is the way people are getting their message out, and this is the way people are learning what's happening in some of these really closed societies. So it's quite interesting. Her husband too. There's a lot of other blogs too. Ioanni's husband, who actually used to work for Hovind too, Drobelde, has a blog as well. And it's pretty good, actually. If anybody wants the address later, I'll give you the address. But I guess what I'm thinking is that even though public expression and the news media is strictly controlled in Cuba, Cubans are finding a way to use these new technologies to get the information that's been blocked to them. They also are learning how to get satellite TV access, which is restricted. There's all kinds of illegal ways you can get that, and they get it hooked up at their house, and they get these cards, and they pay somebody once a month, and people sneak in the antennas and stuff, and they're starting to find all these ways to get technologies to get the information they want, but also to start getting the information out. What they haven't been able to figure out is how to get their message around the island. It's usually, from Cuba to the outside, from the outside into Cuba, but not among Cubans. That hasn't happened yet. But I think the Pandora's box is open, and I think Cubans, once they start learning all these new technologies and start running with it, it's going to be very interesting to see how the Cuban government deals with it, because I think at some point it's going to become uncontrollable. Now, most Cubans are allowed to, under Raul, Cubans for the first time are allowed to have cell phones. So once they have smartphones and can get internet access on their phones, it's going to be pretty wild, I think, depending on how many services are allowed to have on the phones through the Cuban telecommunications monopoly. So I think the Pandora's box has been opened, and there's no closing it now. Not for the citizen journalists of Iran, and not for bloggers in Cuba like Ioani. Yeah.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm right next to you.
Permit me to begin, as Ken did, by pointing out that over in the Baker Library you have an absolutely fabulous exhibition. And Miguel Valladares, I've never met you, sir, but I really admire your work. It is just absolutely terrific. I hope we can get it down to Chapel Hill someday.
Oh, you're so shy.
I also thank the Dickey Center. I thank Ken both for his hosting and for his excessively generous introduction, which you will soon discover wasn't deserved, but I appreciate it. I thank Marisa Navarro. I can't believe that you up here in Hanover are going to let her retire. But they don't have hostage taking in New Hampshire? Oh, okay. In any event, I need to begin by pointing out that, as Ken did, that I'm not a Cuba specialist. I study United States foreign policy. And if I have anything useful to say in my 10 minutes, it's to add a bit of a broader perspective. When you focus on U.S. policy toward a single country, as we have during the seminar, toward Cuba, it's easy to lose track of the forest. And that's really unfortunate, because this is one of those uncommon moments when the forest itself is changing. The broader topic of U.S. policy toward Latin America is rapidly evolving, and I think that broader change is going to force a change eventually in our policy toward Cuba. In the history of U.S. policy toward Latin America, there have been two major cycles, and it happens that the second cycle is now ending. Both cycles were characterized by dramatic upswings in Washington's attention to Latin America. Both upswings were also characterized by an effort to help Latin Americans with their many problems. Both upswings slowly ran out of steam. And then, as we entered the first cycle, which is about where we are today with the second cycle, we slowly shifted to a policy of relative neglect that focused almost exclusively on protecting U.S. interests, as opposed to improving the local residents and helping them with their problems. The first cycle got underway a decade or so before the Spanish-American War and petered out into what we know as the good neighbor policy of the 1930s. We can call it the progressive cycle. Now, time is very short, so let me simply say that in 1898 we found ourselves for the first time in possession of a Latin American country. What are we going to do with it? The Congressional War Resolution had promised Cubans their independence. But as Governor General Leonard Wood told President McKinley in 1899, a year after we came into Cuba, he wrote the president, "We're going ahead as fast as we can, but we're dealing with a race that has steadily been going down for 100 years, into which we have got to infuse new life, new principles, and new methods of doing things." Cuba was the kickoff event in this first progressive cycle. And very slowly, our Cuba thinking spread around the entire region. I think it was captured best in 1919 by President Woodrow Wilson's envoy to El Salvador. The job of a U.S. diplomat in Latin America, he wrote, is to extend our influence over these less favored people with the idea of educating them, improving their development, and making them good citizens of a democracy. Now, this progressive thinking then came into conflict with both Latin American opinion and a changing mood at home. World War I was especially sobering to us in terms of our international adventures. And so the 1920s became a period of winding down a whole series of protectorates that we had collected during the preceding 2 decades. And the first cycle ended with the new policy called the Good Neighbor. The Good Neighbor policy was a policy that focused almost exclusively on advancing U.S. interests, which at the time meant increasing trade to pull us out of the Depression. It specifically avoided any effort to help these less favored people, as the El Salvador envoy said. Now, our cycle, the second cycle, began once again with Cuba. We can call it the Cold War cycle. The Cuban Revolution was to this second cycle what the Spanish-American War was to the first. It was a kickoff event. The principal problem, though, in 1959, as we perceived it, was that Latin America's long dormant masses were coming to life. My generation called it the revolution of rising expectations. We had already lost Cuba to the Soviet Union, and we were going to lose all of Latin America unless we helped them meet their rising expectations. To do that, we developed we created a development bureaucracy in the United States, centered initially on the Agency for International Development, created in 1961, AID. AID's ambition was absolutely breathtaking. JFK's Assistant Secretary of State explained what we were doing in 1963. And listen to this. Many kinds of changes are needed in Latin America. Among them is an understanding of the importance of precision in measurement, a pragmatic rather than a doctrinaire approach to problems, an appreciation of the value of scientific knowledge, and more team spirit and less individualism. Now, AID had no idea how to do this. None. Marisa is not a Latin American, but she's from Spain, so, you know. But, you know, how can we teach her to appreciate the value of scientific knowledge? How would you go about doing? Just say you wanted to teach her that. How would you do that? My very dear friend, Lou Perez, how can we teach him to have a pragmatic rather than a doctrinaire approach to problems? We don't have any idea how to do that, we Anglos in this room, or we who think like Anglos in this room. So we began funneling money to subcontractors who said they knew how. AID put out RFPs, requests for proposals. In the process, AID created today's politically potent development industry. Then, beginning in the early 1980s, a slow shift occurred in the focus of our uplifting, from economic to political development. This has been accompanied by the creation of a second industry, the democracy or the governance industry. The result is, from both the economic and the political drive, is that we have made it possible for thousands thousands of our citizens in this country to have careers in uplifting Latin America. Now, unlike the first cycle, in this second cycle, we basically institutionalized the white man's burden. Like the 1920s, today a very long generation of developing Latin America is coming to an end. Today there's a growing realization that it's going to be increasingly difficult to have a healthy relationship with Latin America so long as we are engaged in uplifting, so long as the institutions based on ending the region's underdevelopment, institutions such as AID or the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, so long as those institutions are active in the region, it's going to be basically impossible to have a healthy relationship with Latin America. Now, there's no way to discuss this in the half a minute that's left for me. So, if you want to see how far we have to go, and if you don't want to take my word for it, let me conclude by referring you to the first sentence of AID's fiscal year 2010 congressional presentation document for Latin America. Every year, AID has to ask Congress for money, and for Latin America, and for the fiscal year that began last October 1st, AID asked for $2.4 billion. What did they want to spend it on? Here's what they said, quote, page 563. To gain the freedom to shape their political destiny, to promote economic opportunity, to ensure energy security, to guarantee personal safety. The unspoken, the unspoken mental foundation of aid and the NED and of U.S. approach to Latin America generally, in both the progressive and the Cold War cycles, is that the United States should help Latin Americans. They need uplifting. So here's the really interesting question. Why to us is it so natural to make this effort? To have an agency for international development or a national endowment for democracy, or to say what President Obama said last April at the Summit of the Americas in Trinidad, the Cuban people are not free, and that's our lodestone, our North Star when it comes to our policy in Cuba. To ask why we behave in this way goes to the very core of our policy toward Latin America and especially to Cuba. We make this effort because we believe the region's inhabitants are backward, they're retarded, they're underdeveloped. Now, we all wince at that, but But we all know what we're talking about. You pick your term, but you know what the word underdeveloped means. It's important then, if I can conclude, and thank you for your patience with me, it's important not to stay focused on one tree, like Cuba in our Latin American forest. The big picture is that we are uplifters. We feel an obligation to help Latin America. I don't think people really at base like to be treated that way. In 1898 or in 1959, we didn't get it. We just didn't get it. We thought Cubans and Latin Americans shortly thereafter would appreciate our charity, our assistance, our foreign aid. Do we still not get it? Well, read AID's 2010 congressional presentation document. It suggests we still don't get it. But AID, like our Cuba policy, is basically dead. We just haven't buried it yet. largely because U.S. domestic politics makes it difficult to do so. But you can learn a lot more about where Cycle 2, and our Cuba policy is going by looking at U.S. policy toward Mexico today. This is a policy that focuses exclusively on protecting and promoting U.S. interests. Drugs, immigration, trade. There is no uplifting in our policy toward Mexico, and that's where we have to go with Cuba. Thank you.
Well, I also want to begin by thanking the Dickey Center for the invitation to be here today. And throughout the day, we've discussed various factors that have allowed the Cuban Revolution to reach the ripe old age of 50. Some people point to the fact that this was a domestic revolution where communism came from within and wasn't imposed by external power. Cuba has some geographical favorability. Being an island and keeping control of an island might be a little easier. But I think there's clearly two main factors that have allowed the Cuban Revolution to last this long. The first is the fact of Fidel Castro, his personality, his leadership, and his ability to execute strategy in a way that's kept the Cuban government in place. And the second is that Fidel has been extremely lucky in his enemies. And many of the policies practiced by those who wished to depose him, in fact, contributed to his ability to maintain power. So what I wanted to do was to spend a few minutes focusing on what's been happening recently in Cuba, and then turn to U.S. policy and eventually get to my assigned question, when and how will the embargo end? And to begin, Fidel Castro now has a new role in Cuba. It's called ex-president. After ruling the island for 49 years, he officially resigned as president in February 2008. And he transferred power to his younger brother, Raul Castro. Now, Raul Castro, who's no spring chicken himself, at the age of 77 years old, previously was elevated to the presidency after holding the peculiar record of being the longest-serving minister of defense of any country in the world, a role that Raul actually held for 49 years before he was elevated to power. The fact of this very smooth leadership transition answers one of what has been a featured question about Cuba for decades, which was, how does Fidel Castro exit the leadership of Cuba? Now we know he fell ill in the summer of 2006, was forced to resign on a provisional basis and handed over power to his brother and a team of other ministers for 19 months, and then they took over the formal leadership role. Now Fidel, however, while he may be out, he is not down. He is in fact still actively engaged in Cuban affairs. Beginning in March 2007, he's been writing periodic op-ed columns in the Cuban state newspaper Granma that have been focusing on both domestic and international topics. And he remains very much a power behind the throne. So while Cuba has executed a transition away from the rule of Fidel, it still remains necessarily incomplete. Now, Fidel Castro has been known for his ability to dodge almost everything that's been thrown his way by enemies, both internal and external. He's a micromanager, someone that has tremendous force of will, that's been known for giving hours-long speeches. At one point, he was offered a Galapagos tortoise as a gift by a visiting dignitary, and then he learned that these tortoises live for 200 years. And Fidel said, I'd love to accept this tortoise as a pet, but the problem is by the time you get attached to them, they die on you. And so Fidel, while he may be no longer officially in charge in Cuba, he appears to be recuperating his health. He's moved out of his tracksuits that he was wearing during convalescence and into kind of a tropical business casual uniform. Just in the last month, he was visiting with leaders from China and Venezuela and remained someone that is to be dealt with. This has created a very strange problem for Raul Castro, who, after waiting almost 5 decades to become the president of Cuba, now actually has that role, but he has to deal with the fact that the ultimate big brother is still in the room. And this has created a governance problem in Cuba insofar as whenever Raul Castro tilts towards some type of economic reform or greater engagement with the United States, expressing a desire for dialogue with the United States, Fidel Castro will often step in and correct him, usually in public through his writings. I said earlier today that the problem Raul Castro has is he's trying to drive Cuba's ship of state, but he has to deal with the most aggressive backseat driver in world history, whose name is Fidel Castro, and continues to play a vital role in Cuban affairs. Nevertheless, one thing that has to be said is that to date, the Cuban leadership transition has been extraordinarily smooth. This really has taken place over the last several years without any sort of challenge emerging from within the regime, certainly no challenge to be noted that has come from outside. And it's also been widely recognized throughout the world. One thing that can be said about Cuba's foreign policy outreach in the last several years is it's been truly impressive. More than 60 heads of state have visited Cuba from a range of countries, including the presidents of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which by my count are the BRIC countries that are reshaping global governance. You have more than a dozen heads of state from the Caribbean and Latin America have visited Cuba. Cuba has improved its relationship with the European Union. And indeed, at times, it sometimes appears that virtually everyone is talking to Cuba, with the exception of the United States. So my first proposition is that Cuba has had a smooth leadership transition. The second has to be that the United States has prepared for the wrong scenario for change. One very noted Cuban scholar, Jorge Dominguez at Harvard University, coined the phrase several years ago, the poof moment. The poof moment in Cuban political studies was the moment at which the Castro regime in Cuba goes poof, vanishes in a cloud of smoke, and is replaced by a democratic, pro-free market government that wants positive relations with the United States and is willing to accept a major role for Cuban exiles in its future. That was Plan A, and much of U.S. policy towards Cuba has been predicated on how can the United States help Cuba once this rapid democratic transition has taken place. However, as we have seen, that proved to not be the scenario as it unfolded. And now the U.S. government is left trying to deal with fashioning a Plan B, which is trying to create relations with a government in Cuba that has executed a communist succession. And this has really thrown U.S. policymakers for a loop, simply because there has not been much thinking, and certainly in the last administration, about how to strategically engage with Cuba. In addition, the United States has to deal with a U.S.-Cuba policy which has become increasingly complicated and complex. There is, of course, the U.S. embargo of Cuba. These are the policy of sanctions and isolation that bans most U.S. trade and travel with the island. But you have to add on to that the fact that we have Radio and TV Marti. These are multi-million-dollar broadcasts out of South Florida. They're intended to provide information, disseminate information to the Cuban people at a price tag of about $27 million a year. Another $45 million has been set aside by the U.S. Congress to aid Cuban dissidents and build up independent opposition groups, journalists, and the like. You add to this the fact that our migration policy allows virtually any Cuban who leaves Cuba and makes it onto U.S. shores is therefore allowed to have a fast track to residency and eventually citizenship. That is a privilege that the United States does not extend to any other migrant that arrives in this country without documents from any other country in Latin America. The U.S. State Department still considers Cuba to be on the list of what we call our state sponsors of terrorism. This is a list of the baddies, of the countries that we feel pose a very severe security threat to the United States. At the time of 2001, there were actually 7 countries that were on this list, Cuba included. Since then, the countries of Iraq, North Korea, and Libya have since been removed. So Cuba is one of the 4 countries that's left on the list, along with Sudan, Syria, and Iran. This is despite the fact that the U.S. State Department report deeming Cuba to be a state sponsor of terrorism, in fact, says that there's no evidence of Cuba participating in any terrorist activities. And so when you add all of this up, you have a U.S.-Cuba policy that's become increasingly complex and has a lot of moving pieces. And while it's most well known for the embargo, it's much, much more than the embargo. In addition to that, the embargo itself has an increasing number of loopholes. In the year 2000, the U.S. Congress passed an amendment that now allows U.S. food producers to sell their goods to Cuba. Those sales commenced in 2001. Since then, U.S. agricultural producers have sold $3 billion of goods to Cuba in one-way, all-cash sales. Last year, the United States was Cuba's 5th largest trading partner, and Cuba was our 25th largest export market for agricultural products. Add on to that close to $1 billion that flows back to Cuba in the form of remittances sent by Cuban Americans who live in this country and are trying to help their families back at home. And of course, the travel ban on Cuba, which is all over the map. You have some people who are allowed to go for artistic, cultural, journalistic reasons. You have the Cuban Americans that are now allowed to travel there freely, really for whatever purpose. You have another 50,000 Americans that enter Cuba as embargo busters through third countries. And the fact is that you don't need to be in Havana very long before you start bumping into other Americans. Another point that has been highlighted just this week as it relates to the U.S. embargo is that the embargo has become so unpopular that it's become very difficult for the United States to work with its allies on Cuba policy. And over the years, there's been the thinking that if the United States, one of the world's great democracies, can work with the rest of the world's democracies, whether they're great or not so great, to help to promote democratic change in Cuba, that this is a positive thing. So you have U.S. officials who have been meeting with Canadians and Spaniards, other members of the European Union, Latin American countries, seeing if we can all work together to promote democracy and democratic change in Cuba. There's just been one small problem with the U.S. effort to work multilaterally to promote democratic change in Cuba, which is the fact that the entire world is in disagreement with the U.S. embargo of Cuba, which was highlighted just this week when the United Nations voted in a vote of 187-3 to condemn the U.S. embargo of Cuba, the 18th year in a row where such a vote was moved forward and passed. Indeed, almost all of our allies, including throughout the European Union and Latin America, voted to condemn the embargo, and only 3 countries voiced their support. Those 3 were the United States, Israel, and the island nation of Palau. The U.S. has actually lost the support of the Marshall Islands, which used to vote with us, but for the last couple of years has abstained. And to add to that, while I can't speak for Palau, Israel has substantial investment in Cuba, and its Israeli tourists frequently visit Cuba. So while they may talk the talk, they do not, in fact, walk the walk when it comes to backing our sanctions policy. So this brings me to the U.S. domestic politics of Cuba, which is obviously a very important factor. And one thing that can be said about the U.S. embargo of Cuba is it has truly been built to last. This is a policy that started out with executive order, was subsequently codified and strengthened further with passages of 2 congressional bills, the Cuba Democracy Act of 1992 and the Helms-Burton Act of 1996. And in addition, there still remains a variety of important actors, particularly Cuban Americans in South Florida, that continue to support the policy to a very large degree. This is true despite the fact that the views in the Cuban American community have actually changed quite considerably over the past decade. And indeed, there's any number of polls of South Florida and of Miami in recent years that indicate that Cuban Americans, on balance, would favor greater trade, greater travel, and greater dialogue between the United States and Cuba. However, almost all of the Cuban American representatives that are in the U.S. Senate or in the U.S. House of Representatives continue to promote a very hard line. And while moderate Cuban Americans have a greater voice and are much more visible, they still really lack the political power to somehow move forward this debate. In addition, the U.S. Congress has really remained quite split on Cuba policy. Right now, there exists bipartisan support for the embargo and bipartisan opposition to the embargo. And when you have Democrats and Republicans divided on both sides of the issue, this often creates a scenario where nothing moves. Add to the fact that the pro-embargo lobby from the Cuban American community has put about $700,000 a year into House and Senate congressional races to support candidates to favor the continuation of the embargo. And the fact is that there's a lot of grit in the wheels that makes it hard for the Congress to pass even simple policy changes. Just to give you one example, there's a bill in Congress today called the Freedom to Travel to Cuba Act, which would lift the travel ban and would allow all Americans to travel to Cuba. It has about 180 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives, about 30 or so in the Senate. It continues to be gaining steam, but still the supporters of this bill are not quite sure if they have the votes to pass it, although they will try to do so later this year. This despite the fact that it's widely supported across a range of sectors. And Cuba remains the only country in the world where the U.S. government will actually fine its citizens for traveling there without previous U.S. government permission. It's not the case with Iran. It's not the case with North Korea or other countries. And this manifests itself in interesting ways. I wrote a book on Cuba that was published about a year ago. And during the time I was writing the book, it was interesting to me that the New York Philharmonic Orchestra traveled to Pyongyang, North Korea in February 2008 for a performance. And Pyongyang, North Korea, as far as I knew, was still considered to be the capital of one of the two countries left in the axis of evil. This was during the Bush administration. Nevertheless, the New York Philharmonic Orchestra made this trip. Recently, the idea was floated that the New York Philharmonic Orchestra should travel to Havana, Cuba, to make a similar trip and create a large performance in Havana. And ultimately, while the musicians affiliated with the New York Philharmonic were allowed to go, the donors and sponsors that are helping to fund the conference could not receive travel licenses to go. So I think it gives you some clue of how unique the Cuba policy remains, that it was actually easier for a major New York orchestra to perform in Pyongyang, North Korea under the Bush administration than it is for the same orchestra to perform in Havana, Cuba during the Obama administration. I was at a congressional reception yesterday where one of the proponents of the Freedom to Travel to Cuba Act, Sam Farr, a congressman from California, noted the fact that today the United States can sell a wide range of agricultural products to Cuba. And he said, today it's easier for a potato to go to Cuba than for a person. And my bill simply seeks to give people the same rights that we currently give our potatoes. To conclude, the when and where the embargo may end, the forces for continuity in the U.S.-Cuba relationship remain quite strong. Nevertheless, there are some new factors to consider. One is the rise of Raul Castro as a new leader, and as Fidel may continue to play a role, but nevertheless, there has been a leadership transition and a possibility for a new style emerging from Cuba. Of course, the Obama administration is still early in its term. It's easy to judge Obama somewhat harshly for the measures that he hasn't taken yet, but the fact is the United States has freed up Cuban-American travel. It has initiated dialogue between the U.S. and Cuban governments on issues such as migration and postal service talks, and there seems to be some pressure towards greater engagement. And so there's kind of two scenarios by which the embargo could end in the future. The one, the dramatic one that everyone loves but is probably least likely, is the Big Bang, where somehow the United States suddenly comes to its senses, says, we've been doing this policy for 50 years and it hasn't really worked, and goes and moves to overturn it. Perhaps the Big Bang could be ushered along if Congress has its bills ready and there's a lot of attention given to Cuba because of the passing of Fidel Castro, which may or may not happen ever. But the fact is that does remain a possibility. Another scenario, and probably more likely, is that the embargo might simply die a death by 1,000 cuts. The fact is you have the agricultural trade that goes in. There may be some other travel that's allowed, even if the whole travel ban isn't lifted. Telecommunications companies can now do business with Cuba under a new regulation that was passed. Cuba's currently exploring for oil. And if it finds a big oil find, it wouldn't surprise me to see the National Security Energy Amendment suddenly emerge in Congress, where oil companies are given the same rights as agribusiness companies. And so while the policy is clearly one that's outlived its usefulness, it does still have some life left in it. And it will be interesting to see in the future whether we see more shifts coming from the Obama administration and to Congress that would allow this policy to finally come to a change. Thank you.
Before I ask the panelists if they want to respond, I have been waiting before to have two people here that I wanted to recognize. One was out and then came in and the other one left, so I'll have to do one now. But two faculty members from Dartmouth were truly instrumental in conceiving, planning, and implementing this conference. One is Professor Marisa Navarro, history professor, and the other is Professor John Carey, the current chair of the government department. I think he just slipped out for a few minutes, so I missed him. But I definitely wanted to recognize both John and Marisa for their wonderful role in this. I also wanted to thank Chris Wolforth, who's the associate director of the Dickey Center, who really did the hard work of contacting everybody and the organizational work. So thank you, Chris. And now I'd like to invite any of the panelists, if anybody wants to remark on anything anybody else said, please. No? Okay, then we can go to questions. And as I said, students first. So please raise your hands.
Wow, people are tired.
Good. Oh, yeah, that's important.
I'm technically not a student
Okay.
anymore. I graduated with a master's degree in liberal studies this June. But
That's
I thank
close
for the
enough.
opportunity,
That's okay.
yes. It's a fascinating panel for me because as a Hungarian, I do pay close attention to the year 1989. I do remember a lot about how the political changes happened in Hungary. Part of that process, a huge part of that process, was a nonviolent transition, which when I was in Cuba in the summer of 2007, studying Spanish at the University of Havana, I witnessed very closely how Cubans who commented on wanting to change yet not wanting violence and still admitting the importance of the revolution were very, I think, articulate about. I wanted to ask you if you see any potential danger of revolutionary changes happening by violence, or will the concept of civil society that was key in the 1989 revolutions have a more significant role in the transitions?
No.
One of the things that I've tried to avoid, we play around about trying to predict Cuba, and I have a hard enough time trying to figure out what happened 100 years ago to try to think of what's going to happen in Cuba. Dan talked about the way Fidel Castro, disappeared. Nobody predicted that Fidel Castro would get sick, almost die, and hang around for a few more years. Nobody predicted that. So my safe prediction is that no matter what happens in Cuba, no one will have predicted it.
Anybody else want to comment?
Well, I hope there isn't a violent. I hope there isn't violence. I hope change doesn't come that way. I think if I think there would be less a chance of violence if the U.S. sort of backed off on its policy toward Cuba. I mean, I think that would really kind of help make things a little bit more smoother. The civil society there really isn't very developed. I mean, there's the church, but I mean, really, people really aren't organized. I mean, it's not like Poland with the Catholic Church and you know, solidarity. I mean, there's really nothing like that. So my hope is that it wouldn't go to violence, because I just don't think the Cuban people deserve that. I think if the Communist Party if it holds on and continues to perpetuate some, you know, sort of modest changes, and that there's change slowly. I mean, I kind of think there'll be more of a slow change, but again, like Professor Perez said, I mean, you can't really predict anything about Cuba. Oh, by the way, somebody just told me about a really interesting book about Hungary, which I'm going to order. It's called Enemies of the People. It's about right before 1989. And do you know about that book? Okay.
She wrote it.
Please.
Did she?
No, I'm talking.
Oh.
Just 1 second, the microphone's coming. Good, thank you.
Good evening. I really enjoyed the panel as well, and I wanted to ask a question. I spent the past 2 years living in the English-speaking Caribbean and attended the Summit of the Americas in Trinidad. And one of the kind of resounding themes of the Summit of the Americas was the common condemnation, particularly among the heads of state in Latin America, of U.S. policy toward Cuba. And living in the English-speaking Caribbean, I was amazed at the popular enthusiasm toward Cuba, particularly in Jamaica and Trinidad. And in Trinidad, the Prime Minister has twice in the past, perhaps 3 years, traveled to Cuba for life-saving cancer surgery, and has done this very prominently, choosing Cuba over the United States. And so I was wondering if any of the members of the panel would be willing to discuss how attitudes about Cuba and the Cuban Revolution have evolved in Latin America and the Caribbean.
No one.
Dan, please, go ahead.
I was also in Trinidad for the summit, and I would say a few things. First of all, the English-speaking Caribbean, they all maintain very positive relationships with Cuba, in part because Cuba is a big regional power in the Caribbean. It's far and away the largest country. Cuba does a lot in terms of medical training and medical support in the Caribbean as well, not just for the presidents and prime ministers, but for other leaders. There's in some countries, some of the smaller islands, like up to 5 to 10% of the population of Dominica, Grenada, have gone to Cuba for eye surgeries through miracle missions and things of that nature. And more broadly, in Latin America, there's just been a total sea change on the issue of Cuba. The vast majority of the countries in the hemisphere broke off relations with Cuba following the Communist Revolution of 1959. Earlier this year, the last two holdouts to restoring ties with Cuba, Costa Rica and El Salvador, relented. So now every single country in Latin America and the Caribbean has normal diplomatic relations with Cuba. And the fact is that many Latin American leaders see the U.S. embargo of Cuba as a relic of the Cold War and would like to see it lifted. And it's also created widespread sympathy for Cuba in Latin America as a whole. So you have not just the usual suspects like Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales and certain left-leaning leaders, but also President Lula from Brazil, President Bachelet from Chile, and members of the centrist left also calling for the policy to be changed. One last point on this is the summit was fascinating because Cuba, of course, and for those who don't know, the Summit of the Americas is a big summit of all the countries of the Western Hemisphere that takes place every 4 years, and the only country not invited is Cuba. And so Cuba was the only country not at this summit, and it was a major topic of discussion among all of the leaders who really wanted to see the Obama administration turn the page. And I think that the Obama administration listened very carefully to that and is aware of Latin America's views, but has to deal with its own politics in terms of shifting the policy.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on one point that Dan raised, and that is Cuba's very, very effective use of medicine and medical assistance as a tool of foreign policy. They have a large number of doctors that they have sent to Africa and I believe throughout Latin America, and it's garnered a lot of very strong positive, sympathy for Cuba. It's been a very effective form of foreign policy. Next question. Yeah, in the back.
Hi, thank you first. And I was wondering if you would describe La Revolution as a failed experiment, or if there's something among the ideas of Che and Fidel that we could and should learn.
That's you again.
That's Lou. Lou, that's yours.
A few years ago, I was at a conference and we talked about indices of democracy in Latin America. Freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of opposition, freedom of religion. And the list went from top to bottom. At the top, I think it was Argentina, Chile, Brazil. The bottom was Cuba and Haiti. I'm looking at this and saying, what's wrong with this list? So I said, how about if we change the parameters, the criteria? How about if we say literacy, housing, nutrition, healthcare, infant mortality, longevity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What happens to that list? Guess what? Cuba's at the top, Haiti's still at the bottom. But Cuba's at the top. So do we then conclude, do we then infer from that that democracy is incompatible with social justice? And I think when you hear Americans saying they want the transition to democracy, they want democratic procedures. And then when you hear someone else say, we look for social justice, you could pick up their politics right away. And so if you're talking about social justice, under extraordinarily difficult circumstances, Cubans haven't done half badly.
Can I just add?
Please go right ahead.
I would just add into that. If you look at the countries that do well in social policy in Latin America, Cuba is one of them. But you have Uruguay, there's Costa Rica, there's Chile, and you see certain commonalities among them. These are countries that tend to spend a higher percentage of the government budget on things like education, healthcare. They sustain it over time. They work a lot in terms of training, increasing access. And so the question, I think, for Cuba, because it has had successes in those areas, but was that worth the price that was paid in terms of restriction of political freedoms and liberties? Because you do have other countries in the region that come out pretty well that haven't had to go through the same experiment Cuba did.
Please.
Thank you for coming. I appreciate the presentation's been really good. This is sort of like a loaded question, so I'll try to go through it. I wrote it down as he was going. It's on U.S. policy, U.S.-Cuba policy, and sort of like our standing in the world. Do you think it undermines our commitment to basic human rights and the UN Declaration of Human Rights if we choose to engage with or establish friendly relations with a government that actively denies its own citizens those basic human rights? So I guess our standing in the world.
Lars?
No.
Good luck with that.
I don't want to respond. No, look. Well, let me try to meld yours with the previous one. How about that? We have a policy which the answer would be no, it would not help our status in the world if we were to engage with countries that behaved inappropriately, as you suggest. But our overarching policy, look, what we want from Cuba since the end of the Soviet Union is democracy. That is the Torricelli Act, which has been mentioned a couple of times, is called the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992. The Helms-Burton Act, which has also been remarked upon, is called the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996. Our goal is democracy in Cuba. The questions are, can we help bring democracy to Cuba? And if we can, should we? Now, my answer is no, we cannot help. So the second question is, as my children like to say when they want to annoy me, merely academic. Democracy is best conceived of as a never-ending process of political contestation. Nobody is born a Democrat. People become Democrats by arguing with one another on a daily basis, often over issues that really matter a lot. We have, in Cuba in particular, given the history, and I urge you to read this history of U.S. behavior in Cuba, we have made ourselves singularly incapable of helping to bring democracy to Cuba. The best thing that we could do is just to back off, to stop. So my answer to your question is no. I would just not. The reason I sighed and closed my eyes when you asked your question is because I would prefer that we back away, that we not address your question about whether it's a good idea for us to do this or not, what it will mean to us or to the Cubans, because to us, well, that's someone else's topic. To the Cubans, I think the evidence is so overwhelming, both from the point of view of democratic theory, of how you get to be a democracy, and from the point of view of U.S. policy toward democracy in Cuba, which we have intentionally perverted time and time again since 1898 or before. No. The answer is no.
Let me add, this is a question that always baffles me. Why does democracy in Cuba trump democracy in Egypt? Our standing in the world is not affected by the fact that we have normal diplomatic relations with Libya, or Vietnam, or Saudi Arabia, or another 100, 125 countries in the world, very few of whom would rise to the measure and meet the standard of democracy. Who the hell cares? Who cares? Why does Cuba now send some litmus test that we have to bring democracy to Cuba? You know what it is, we want democracy for our enemies. Okay? And our allies, they could do whatever they want. All right? And the problem with democracy, as we found out in Chile, for example, democracy is so porous. One of the reasons that the Cuban Revolution has survived is exactly because it's not a democracy. Otherwise, it would have been gone. It would have been penetrated. It would have been subverted. Look what happened in Chile, a perfectly lovely constitutional democracy subverted by the Americans. Or Guatemala. I mean, the list is long. So democracy is something that just is so porous, so fragile. And the country with the resources and the capacity of the United States could just about topple any democracy it chooses to. So an explanation why the Cuban Revolution has survived is because it's not democratic. And I'm not sure that that becomes the litmus test of whether it's in the U.S. interest or we look kindly upon. If that's the test, then it's too late. It's too late.
Question back there.
Thank you guys. I'm a Cuban American from Miami, and speaking of 50 years, you're talking about, two generations that have now grown up, either displaced from their country here in the United States, or two generations that have grown up entrenched in that communist atmosphere. And I've personally noticed a giant gap between, my generation's ideas about Cuba and what should go on between my father's generation, and definitely completely different than my grandparents' generation, who had to leave the island when they were 35, 40 years old. And I was wondering, is there the same kind of generational gap going on now in Cuba? And would it be more, we've dealt with this for 50 years, and now I'm tired of, not getting enough food, and I'm tired of what is going on, or, this is all I've known, this is all I've dealt with, and kind of coming to accept it?
Yeah, I think I can. I think the generational gap does exist, and approximately 70% of Cubans on the island today were born after the revolution, and particularly there's Fidel Castro's generation, which were like 70s and 80s, and then their kids would be kind of my generation, like 40s and 50s, and then their kids would be like around your age, are really disaffected. I mean, they don't care about any of this. They don't care about politics. They don't care about, they want to get out of there. They want iPods and they want a cell phone. I mean, they want a decent job. They want to travel. They want access to the internet. They want stuff that, young people want. And they, they don't want to work because the the pay is really horrible. It's like $20 a month. They're like, well, why should I do that? I can sell all this stuff. My Aunt Lucia sends me from my aunt. Like, they sell this stuff. Like, they get all like T-shirts and like the hats and everything, and they just sell them. That's how they make money. So there is a huge generational gap, but I don't see them doing anything. Like, just like your generation in South Florida really isn't doing. You know what I mean? It's not. It's kind of sick of it, in a way.
I definitely feel like our generation is a far more moderate stance on Cuba and, wanting more open ties. Me and my sister and I always talk about, wanting to go back and visit our family members. And then my grandmother talks about that if she ever heard that we went there, that was the day she dies.
Yeah, and then she would weep, and yeah.
No,
Yeah.
that's a
pretty
very
typical,
good point.
yeah.
That's very good point. I have many students, your generation, and some graduate students. I've got a graduate student right now who goes to Cuba to do her dissertation research, and she tells her grandparents that she's in Guatemala. Okay, for that very reason.
Don't tell la
I
abuelita.
mean, there is like,
No la digas.
yeah, no, it's an amazing phenomenon how the weight of grandparents falls on the shoulders of the grandchildren.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, maybe link it with the previous question too, that I think that when you think about change and positive change in Cuba, it's going to come from the bottom up and not from the top down. It's not going to be a negotiation between top U.S. diplomats and top Cuban diplomats over a democratic transition. It's probably not going to be the generation of people that created a lot of these problems who are going to solve it. So in that way, I think to have, young people, be they American or Cuban American from here, get to know their counterparts in Cuba, and vice versa, could have a long-term positive effect on the democratization of the island. That doesn't mean that you couldn't necessarily have diplomatic relations with Cuba as well as to manage joint problems the two countries share, as we do with other countries that we might not disagree on certain things.
Any other student questions? I just, all right, why don't you just go ahead and then we'll take one or two others.
Oh, thank you. I'm not too familiar with the justifications that the government gives for its policies or whatever, so I'm sure you know this better than I do, and I've always been really interested in knowing, I guess Anita, you may be able to speak to this. Why does the government restrict freedom of the press, for instance, or don't allow you to leave the island? What are the justifications that they give for that?
Well, there's a real control culture that's gone on since the beginning. I mean, I think there seems to be, and I'm sort of flummoxed by it too, and living there was vexing, but there's this obsession with control and of like losing control, and I think at least in the last 20 years in particular, it has a lot to do with the collapse of the Berlin Wall. I mean, they studied that. They don't want that to happen there. They were really pissed off about that. On the leaving the island, I think a lot of that has to do with a brain drain idea. For instance, doctors and medical workers, I forget how many years they have to work in their profession. I think it's 7 years before they can leave, or I think it's 7 years before they have to request. So they don't want all the doctors and medical workers leaving because their idea is like, the revolution paid for your education and we can't afford to let you go. And they also use it to control people. They use it to control dissidents. and they used it to control state security people because they don't want state security people going and, you know, spilling their guts. So it was like that. And freedom of the press, I think it's along the same lines. They really, I think a lot of it was Fidel too, because, you know, I have to tell you something about this guy. He is about the thinnest skinned person I think I've ever seen. I mean, when he was in power and we would write stories that mentioned him, like those were the stories we always got called in for. Like I did a story, it was like a nothing story, about there were always these rumors, you know, like he has this and he has that, and there was a rumor that he had prostate cancer, and evidently he hated that. I got called into the international press editor, like, you know, dejen paz el prostato de comandante. You know, like they were really, like he was really mad at the mention of his prostate in a news story that went across the United States. So I think part of it was him. But I think these societies too, there's just sort of this fear of losing control. And they're afraid if they let people say too much, or say things too harshly, that they'll lose a grip. I think that's it. I think it's fear of losing control.
Very reminiscent to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Denny.
A couple of points. To the young lady who studied,
Just a second, Denny. Yeah, there you go.
The young lady who studied Spanish in Havana, there's another story about Cuban medicine, and that's the fact that the president of Guyana died on a Cuban operating table. So there's another side to that. Three of the four panelists seem to me, at least my impression, is that they paint a rather benign picture of Cuba, and only Ms. Snow detailed some of the glitches in that system. And I just wonder, this gentleman raised the question about the fact that you're not free to leave Cuba. But if Cuba is so high on the social schedule, or whatever that list you call, why is it that they have to lock their people in? Why has there been no mention tonight about Cuban political prisoners, about the kind of tyranny that the Castros have exercised over that island for 50 years? Why is it that a right-wing dictatorship in Chile, for example, is anathema to all of you and to everybody? But it seems to be perfectly acceptable that we've had the Castros for 50 years. I wonder if you could comment on that.
sure. I don't mention it because you all know it. That's all you know. You just gave it perfectly. You know, I would say that you are an intelligent, well-read gentleman, and you know it. So I don't have to tell you. But I'm going to tell you something you don't know. And that is, you know, some of the issues that are involved in that policy, some of the good things, to try to balance what you know. So why repeat it?
While few Cubans bargained for the rigid command economy or for the stifling political intolerance that befell their island, the Cuban Revolution clearly constituted a deep-seated expression of Cuban volition. Does that satisfy you, sir? Thank you.
Last question.
It's a question to the whole panel, but just picking on Mr. Schoultz's statement earlier on about the U.S. policy towards Cuba, could I be far off the mark if I said that the policy on Cuba is more about an older generation of politicians holding on to the bygone years about how Cuba was? Because I think, from what I've heard, very briefly, that there's a lot of good things and obviously very terrible things of political prisoners in Cuba. But could that not be, you know, sort of put to the side, and we dwell more on the positive for the sake of the humanitarian crisis in Cuba? Because, you know, if we try and talk about democracy, countries like China don't have democracy. I think in Palestine, democracy got Hezbollah in, and it's a total kerfuffle. So that is my question to you. Is there no way it can be, if some of these things can be put aside but still addressed at a later stage, and we mainly concentrate on the majority of the Cubans?
Well, I'll just briefly respond by saying I think that's what the gentleman in the red plaid shirt was saying a few minutes ago, and I certainly agree with your view. Look, the generation that I come from, the part of it that has the gray hair in this room, isn't capable, I think, now of rethinking this process of rapprochement in the way that's required. My friend Lou told me one time, he said, you know, what the Cubans really want is respect. And my generation is not capable of doing that. It's going to come from you youngsters.
Yeah, I think we've just kind of run out, unless, Wei, you have a very quick question.
Well, yeah, so it's more of an observation. It is more of an observation, but we tend too easily to overlook that the highest rate of incarceration in all countries in the world is the one in America, which holds the highest castigation voice for other countries, and that includes political prisoners. And that's something that we just accept as we look around at all other countries in the world. And I think that's something that other countries don't overlook as they look at us, because we just have a tremendous amount of people in prison, including very often people of minority groups, particularly Latin Americans and, of course, Afro-Americans.
Could I just follow up on that for one quick second? Dan Erikson mentioned that this year our Agency for International Development is paying how many?
$45 million.
$45 million to implement the plan, the 2004 updated 2006 plan of the Commission for Assistance to a Free Cuba. There are 6 chapters in that, and 5 of them cannot be addressed, like withstanding environmental degradation. That's chapter 5. 5 of them cannot be addressed until the first one is addressed, which is called Hastening Cuba's Transition. So we are spending $45 million this year to overthrow the Cuban government. In the United States, and if I may, sir, in the United States, the USA Patriot Act will put you in jail forever for taking a dime from Al-Qaeda, which wants to do to us what we want to do to Cuba. There is no secret. There is a relationship between repression and threat. And if we were to stop threatening, I really wonder, I do not study Cuba. You all heard me say that, right? I really wonder what would happen if the threat disappeared. Think of what would happen to you if you took money from Al-Qaeda. And that's the way the Cuban government looks at taking money, and that the 75 that Dan mentioned today that were thrown in jail in 2003, it would be remarkable to see what would happen in Cuba if the threat were to be removed. But thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate your comment.
That's the last word. Oh, go ahead, Dan. You'll have the last word.
Yeah, well, I just want to say, because I feel a little bit like my views on Cuba were mischaracterized by one of the questions. I mean, there seems to be some concern about democracy and human rights, and is the panel not kind of being critical enough of Cuba on that front, or not pushing it? And I think, I mean, it's clear from the evidence, most notably Fidel Castro's 50 years at the helm of Cuba, more than 1 million people that have fled the country into exile, that Cuba's situation as it relates to political and civil liberties is dismal. And that's been amply documented by any number of human rights agencies. I think one thing that this panel is focusing on, though, is to what degree is U.S. policy contributing to that? And the fact is that Cuba has a national security state, that they are a state that are obsessed with their own political stability, obsessed with national security, and view the United States to be an existential threat to their existence. And it's under that rubric that explains and describes a lot of the reasons that the Castro government has kept such a tight lid on that place for 50 years.
Last word, and thank you all very much.